Every night, he drew faces in the dust faces no one had seen in years. Some had vanished without a trace. Others were declared dead. But when he drew my husband's face, mouth sewn shut, I knew these weren't just a child's drawings. Stay until the end. What I found beneath the floorboards of room 3 will haunt you. My name is Nora Kell. I'm 34, recently widowed, and I clean rooms at the Copper Vale Inn, a crumbling lodge clinging to the edge of a mining town nobody claims anymore. People pass through. Stay a night. Leave without looking back. That's how it's always been. Quiet, forgotten, safe in its own strange way. Until 3 weeks ago, when a wagon rolled in past sundown, the driver didn't speak much, just handed over a pale, silent boy no older than 7 and muttered, "This is Simon. Someone paid for a month. Don't let him stop drawing." Then he was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving nothing but dust in that boy. Simon hasn't said a single word since. He just watches. Big eyes, always watching. We tried asking where he's from, who his family is, but he never answers. Instead, he picks up anything that leaves a mark, sticks, nails, coal, and draws in whatever dust he can find. The walls, the window panes, the backs of chairs, even the floor under the beds. At first, we thought it was strange, maybe even sweet, a way for him to cope, but then the drawings started repeating. Always faces, dozens of them. Sad eyes, hollowed cheeks, some angry, some frightened, none smiling. On the 3rd night, I found him crouched by the front desk, drawing along the wooden baseboards with a burnt matchstick. I leaned down to look and froze. The face had a scar, slicing through the right brow, and a chipped front tooth details too specific to be imagination. It looked like Agnes, the old woman who vanished from room 4 last spring. Everyone assumed she wandered into the canyon, but now, I didn't sleep that night. Since then, I've been watching his drawings closer, studying them before the wind wipes them away, and I've started to recognize more. A bartender who left town, a prospector no one's seen since last winter, even the sheriff's cousin, who vanished 10 years back. Last night, Simon drew a new face, and I wish he hadn't, because it was someone I buried, someone I cried over, my husband, Dale. His eyes were the same, but in the drawing, his mouth was sewn shut. Thread, needle marks, pulled tight. I stared at it for a long time, too long, and then I noticed something worse. The drawing had been made before the dust settled. The next morning, I stared at the face again. It was still there, etched into the floorboards beneath the staircase, perfectly undisturbed. Simon had vanished into his usual corner near the hearth, quietly dragging a piece of charcoal over the stone wall. I didn't speak to him. I couldn't. My heart was thundering too loud for words. That face wasn't just a memory, it was impossible. My husband, Dale, died in a mining collapse 15 months ago. Or so I'd been told. The sheriff, the foreman, even the preacher gave me the same story. His body was never recovered. Too deep, they said, buried under tons of rock. They gave me a folded flag, a sealed box of soot-covered belongings, and told me to move on. But Simon had drawn him, and not how he looked in life, but with his mouth stitched shut, a detail so grotesque, so vivid, it twisted my stomach. That wasn't grief or imagination, that was something else. I waited until the boy went outside to feed the inn's barn cats. Then I grabbed a rag and tried to wipe the drawing away. My hand trembled as I pressed it down, only for the face to smear, but not vanish. No matter how hard I scrubbed, the eyes stayed, watching. Later that day, I brought the sheriff inside. "Humor me," I said, guiding him to the baseboard where Simon had drawn the woman I thought was Agnes. He squinted, then leaned closer. His face went pale. "That's Lucille," he whispered. "My cousin. Went missing in '89. Folks figured she ran off to Kansas City." "She didn't," I said. "Simon drew her, just like he drew Dale." The sheriff looked over at Simon, who now sat cross-legged by the stairs, scribbling silently in the dust with a piece of driftwood. Then he stepped back and shook his head. "This is a child, Nora, a quiet one. Sure, maybe troubled, but that don't make him a prophet." "He's not guessing," I said. "Look at the details. The scar, the locket chain, the earrings. That's not guessing." The sheriff left in silence. I could see it in his eyes, she knew. But denial's easier than dread. That night, I watched Simon from my doorway. The fire had gone low. Shadows stretched long across the lobby floor. He was drawing again this time with no dust, no charcoal. Just a single finger gliding across the polished wood. And when I looked the next morning, there were 5 new faces. One of them was mine. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the hallway outside, room 3, back pressed to the wall, knees to my chest. I listened. At first, there was nothing. Just the creak of the inn settling into its bones, the distant moan of wind brushing against broken shutters. But then came the scratching, faint at first, like someone drawing with a nail on wood. I knocked. No answer. I turned the knob slowly and pushed the door open. Simon sat on the bed, knees tucked under him, head cocked to one side. The wallpaper behind him was torn, clawed away in long streaks. And beneath it, beneath the paper and the paint and the decades of dust, were more drawings. Not charcoal, not chalk. Etched. Scratched into the wood with something sharp, maybe a blade. Hundreds of faces, carved into the wall like a forest of the forgotten. Most were faded, some half-finished, some overlapping. But, others looked fresh. Simon didn't react to me, just placed a hand on the wall like he was listening to it. I stepped closer, trying to understand what I was seeing, and then I saw Dale again, my husband, but not how I remembered him. His eyes in the carving weren't peaceful, they were wide, terrified. His stitched mouth seemed deeper, crueler. I reached out and touched the groove where his name had been carved below the chin. But the wood, it was warm. I stumbled back, heart racing. Simon finally looked at me. He raised a finger and pointed to the floor, then knelt, pulled back the thin rug, and revealed something even worse. A trapdoor. I had never seen it before. I'd cleaned that room a dozen times before the boy came. There had never been a door in the floor. But there it was, iron ring, oak slats. No dust around the edges, like it had been used recently. Simon tapped the ring with his fingernail, then looked at me, expectant. I didn't move, couldn't. So he stood, silent and steady, and walked to the far wall, picked up a piece of coal, and drew another face. It was me, but this time my eyes were closed, and behind me was an open trapdoor. Chapter 5. Beneath room 3. I waited until morning. The light didn't make the trapdoor less terrifying, but it gave me the illusion of control. Simon had already left the room, sitting calmly in the lobby with a blank page torn from the guest ledger, drawing again. As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't carved my dead husband into the wall or shown me a door that shouldn't exist. I knelt beside the trapdoor and pulled the ring. It resisted at first, and then creaked open with the slow groan of something that hadn't seen daylight in decades. A dark hole yawned beneath me, the air thick and damp, reeking of earth, mildew, and something older, something metallic. There were steps, carved stone, leading downward. I hesitated, then descended. The air shifted with each step heavier, wetter, like memory pressing down. I reached the bottom and found a narrow tunnel, its walls roughly bricked and blackened by time. My candle barely lit more than a few feet ahead, but I could see claw marks along the stone. Not animal, human. I followed the passage, heart hammering with each footfall. Then I found the first cell, a crude iron door, rusted but intact. No window, just a slot in the center. I opened it. Inside, a skeleton, curled on its side, mouth wide in an eternal scream. On the wall, behind it scratches, dozens, all tally marks. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. This was no mining tunnel. This was a prison. A secret prison. I found more doors, more remains, and on every wall drawings, carved with fingernails, rocks, rusted spoons. Some were faces, others were names. One door had a message scratched into the iron. "We are still here." I stumbled into a wider chamber at the end of the tunnel. A pit in the center. Bones. So many bones, scattered like trash. And on the far wall, the largest carving of all. A mural. Hundreds of faces, some faded, some new. And in the center, larger than the rest, Simon, or at least someone who looked like him. Older, hollow-eyed, hands outstretched. A child, a witness. Above him, scratched into the stone. He remembers what we're forced to forget. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me? I turned. Simon stood there in the flickering light. And he was crying. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Not with the faces burned into my thoughts, not with the memory of that breath cold and close whispering from the dark. I sat at the edge of my bed, the inn groaning in the wind like it knew the weight of its secrets. Downstairs, Simon didn't move. Just sat by the fireplace, knees pulled to his chest, drawing on the stone hearth with the edge of a broken tile. At dawn, I walked to the chapel. It stands at the far end of town, warped and leaning, with a crooked steeple and shattered stained glass that throws broken color across the grass. No one worships there anymore. They stopped after the fire. After the preacher hanged himself from the bell rope, but the place still breathes. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old ash. The pews sat in rows like mourners sagging with rot. I moved carefully toward the altar, where blackened pages of hymnals curled like dying leaves. Then I saw them. Faces. Not carved this time drawn in ash. Hundreds, covering the pews, the floor, the walls. Some smudged, some crisp. I reached out and wiped one clean with my sleeve. Underneath the ash, the wood was scorched, as if the fire had stopped at each face, preserving them through the flames. It was impossible and deliberate. Then I heard something behind me. The door had shut, not slammed, clicked, like it had locked. I turned and ran to it, tried the handle. It didn't move. I pounded, screamed, but the town was too far and the morning too quiet. I turned back to the chapel. The bell rang once. The sound echoed through my chest, low and hollow, like a final breath. I dropped to my knees, dizzy, and then the air shifted. Behind the altar, something stirred. A shape began to rise, not a person, but a shadow. Tall, thin, with no eyes, just a featureless face. But as I stared in horror, the ash behind it began to shift, as if pulled by invisible fingers, and one by one, the faces rearranged themselves staring at me, all of them, their mouths opening in silent screams. I backed away, praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening. Then the chapel door creaked open. Simon stood there, barefoot, covered in soot, and holding a piece of wood like a chalk stick. He raised it and drew a single line across the chapel floor, cutting me off from the shadow behind the altar. The faces stopped moving. Simon looked at me and whispered his first words since he arrived. Remember, Chapter 8, The Ledger of the Lost. After the chapel, nothing felt solid anymore. I walked back to the inn with Simon by my side. He didn't speak again, just held my hand like a child clinging to the last good thing in a burning house. My legs felt hollow, my mind splintered. Remember, he'd said. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. Back inside, I went straight to the front desk. To the guest ledger's 30 years of names scrawled in fading ink, pages brittle from time and smoke. I pulled them all down, spread them across the lobby floor. The fireplace behind me crackled, throwing light over names long forgotten. Simon watched silently from the stairwell. I began comparing. Every name I remembered, every face I had seen on the walls, in the dust, in the ash, I searched for them. Some weren't there, but some were. Check-in dates, initials, a note that read paid in advance. Then, nothing. No checkout, no signature, just a line. Then I found something worse. A gap. 15 pages torn from one of the older ledgers. Ripped clean, the binding still bleeding thread. I held the book to my chest, bile rising in my throat. Someone had erased the records. On purpose. But not all of them. Tucked between pages was a slip of folded paper, yellowed and fragile. I unfolded it slowly. It was a map. A crude one, drawn in ink and charcoal. It showed the inn, the tunnels beneath, and a route marked in red leading through the cellar to another point tone, labeled simply, Well Room. I had never heard of it, but I knew I had to go. That night, once the guests were asleep, what few there were, I lit a lantern and crept down into the basement. The stone walls were moist, breathing cold air. The old wine racks sat empty and crumbling. But in the far corner, behind an unused coal bin, I found it. A small wooden door, nailed shut. The boards were newer than the surrounding stone. I pried them loose. The room beyond was circular, carved directly into the earth. In the center, a brick well with no rope, no bucket, just a yawning hole into blackness. Around the rim were names, scratched in different hands in different eras. Some I recognized, most I didn't. Then I saw Simon's pre-pro, fresh, right near the edge. And beside it, mine, etched, waiting. Behind me, I heard a voice, not a whisper this time. A man's voice. Gravel and grief? You weren't supposed to come back. I turned and saw Dale. I couldn't move. Dale stood in the doorway of the well room, backlit by lantern light, his silhouette heavy and wrong. The man I had buried in grief stood in front of me now, except not exactly him. His mouth, it was sewn shut. Crude stitches crossed his lips, dark thread knotted like wire. His eyes shimmered, not with life, but with something trapped, something pleading. He raised one trembling hand toward me and shook his head slowly, as if to say, "Don't scream, don't run." But my knees buckled anyway. I backed into the well, nearly toppling over the edge. A sour wind rose from below, curling around my ankles. The room whispered. I couldn't understand the words, but they felt old, ancient, angry. Dale stepped forward. And then Simon was there. He moved between us without fear, walked right up to Dale and placed a finger to his chest. For a long moment, they stared at each other, man and boy, living and not, memory and truth. Then Simon reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. A small piece of paper, folded neatly. He handed it to Dale. Hands shaking, Dale unfolded it. His eyes widened. The stitches on his mouth quivered. Simon turned to me, pointed at the well, and said a second word, beneath. Dale dropped the paper. It floated to the floor like ash. And then, without sound or ceremony, he stepped backward into the shadows and was gone. I rushed forward and snatched the paper. It was brittle, old, a ledger entry. Dale's name. Check-in, the 14th of March, room 3. And below it, in a different hand, witness too much, mind too deep, spoke to the wrong face. I sank to the ground, the words crawling through me like rot. Dale hadn't died in a collapse. He'd discovered something down there, in the tunnels, something the town had buried, something the inn was built to protect, not shelter from. That's why his mouth had been sewn shut, not by death, but by someone, to silence him. Forever. Simon sat beside me, took my hand again. His face was unreadable, too old for his body, too knowing for his silence. And then he whispered, the last thing I expected. You have to draw now. I looked at the wall, and there, waiting in dust, was the beginning of a new face. Mine. Chapter 10. The dust remembers. The inn is quiet now. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels like breath held beneath floorboards. Like the walls themselves are listening, waiting. I sit at the desk where this all began. Simon sleeps curled in the armchair near the hearth, a charcoal nub still clutched in his fingers. Even in rest, his hand twitches still, drawing in dreams. The dust moves on its own now. Not always, just enough to remind me it's alive. Enough to show me what I'd rather forget. Because I drew the face. Mine. At first, I told myself I was only pretending, only playing along to make sense of what Simon had shown me. But when the lines began to fill in on their own, when the mouth formed not by my hand but by the dust shifting, I knew. This place chose me. I've gone back to the well room 3 times. Each time, there are new names etched into the brick. People I knew. People I'd spoken to. One was a woman who checked in last week. She left without a goodbye or so, I thought. But now her name glows faintly in the stone. The truth is simple and sickening. The Copper Vale Inn is built atop a graveyard of guilt, of secrets. It doesn't just bury bodies, it absorbs them, feeds on them. The tunnels aren't just underground, they're inside the inn, in its walls, its bones. It is alive with everything the town refused to remember. Simon wasn't sent here by accident. He was born of it, or maybe claimed by it. I don't know. But he sees what we can't, draws what we hide. And now that he's spoken to, method drawings have started appearing without his hand at all. I awoke this morning to find every mirror in the inn covered in faces. Hundreds of them, watching me, some smiling, most not. And on the lobby wall, scrawled in soot, one remains. The last guest just checked out. I watched him drive off into the fog, his eyes darting nervously in the rear view. He won't get far, no one does, because the faces are calling. And the inn remembers. Simon has gone back to room 3. He's humming now, a tune I've never heard but somehow know by heart. He placed a piece of charcoal beside me. And now it's my turn. I dip it into the dust and begin. Not with a face, but with a door. And behind it, all of us, waiting